Real Cannabis Fihe Do and Daracale. Moving on to private members' business, specifically the Misuse of Drugs Cannabis Regulation Bill 2022 second stage. And the Deputy Gino Kenny to move that the bill be now read a second time.
I do move.
Okay, the motion has been
Thanks.
moved. So
thank you very much. And I've shared in time with Deputy Murphy and Deputy Boyd Barrett. First of all, Minister, I want to thank the OPLA in relation to this bill. Even though it's a very kind of short bill, they've done a lot of work around the kind of the permissibility of this bill, and they found it legally permissible under many kind of stipulations of law, including European law, that this bill actually could, you know, if there was political will, could be legislated for. So that's important to note. And I want to welcome to our esteemed guests from all parts of the world today, our public gallery, and I think a lot of people here have shown a huge amount of commitment in relation to this issue. And Minister, this debate has gone on for decades. In my living memory, you know, the default position of the state has been to continue to criminalise and incarcerate people for drug use. And wherever you believe the moral and ethical issues around drug use, we've had 6 decades of this. Ireland has one of the highest drug-related deaths in Europe. Our prisons are overflowing in relation to addiction issues, in relation to the drug kind of industry. So you would think, after 6 decades of failure, that, you know, things will have moved on. And this debate has evolved. I think, you know, including myself, I think most people are more educated, they're more informed, and they're more enlightened in relation to what has gone before and what needs to happen now. Because, as I said before, you know, imprisoning people, criminalising people, stigmatising people doesn't work. And we've seen that in other jurisdictions. So it's important to move on. And I think many people are questioning the logic of actually our anti-drug laws in the first place. These were written in the 1970s. The war on drugs was in its kind of its full throes, and the war on drugs, if you really kind of scratch the surface, was kind of racism concentrated. It was class concentrated in relation to poor people, in relation to people of colour. But that's for another debate, for another time. And gladly, Minister, public opinion has progressed and has moved on. You know, they don't have all these hang-ups that others have in relation to, you know, discriminating people. And the Citizens' Assembly have, you know, have projected that we need to move on from the status quo, because the status quo simply doesn't work. And the Citizens' Assembly made a lot of recommendations, including non-legislative recommendations in relation to treatment, in relation to how we approach this issue. But it also made a fundamental stance around, you know, criminalising people. And in order to do that, Minister, you have to change the law. As simple as that. That's the way our party would see it, and many others. Including the Citizens' Assembly making its recommendations around stop criminalising people, the Justice Committee had a very good report here 15 months ago. And it was a very kind of damning indictment of our criminal justice system, of continuously criminalising people. And in my interpretation, and many other people's interpretation, is that, you know, they advocated a different model of a different approach in relation to how we approach drug use and misuse. We all understand that. And that went further about, you know, stop criminalising people. Looking at different kind of models and jurisdictions and so forth. So, just to get on to what this bill is about. This bill is a very kind of moderate bill. I'm the first one to say that. We're the first one to say that. We think hopefully it's a precursor to full regulation of cannabis. So it's a kind of a moderate bill in relation to the simple possession of cannabis for personal use. That's up to 7 grams. And anybody has asked me, well, why 7 grams? Look at Luxembourg, look at what Malta have done. They have kind of stipulated 7 grams. Small amount, but for their simple possession. So, if that was legislated tomorrow, somebody with that amount of cannabis would not be prosecuted, would not have to go through the criminal justice system, and so forth. So, in that kind of guise, then you would think that would make sense. You would think that would make sense. But, you know, sense, I think, sometimes goes to the door. Now, the adult caution scheme was introduced in 2020. And that is extremely arbitrary. That is on the discretion of an individual guard in relation to those that they may find in possession of small amounts of drugs. So since 2020, the amount of people that have been charged and brought through the criminal justice system has exploded. It hasn't gone down. It has gone to over 6,500 people are brought to a court in relation to simple possession. So it's very arbitrary, and you know, do individual guards use their discretion? I think in most cases they don't, and it shouldn't be up to an individual guard. The law should change in relation to, you know, simple possession, and that's what, you know, our bill is about, and that's what the Citizens' Assembly have made its recommendations on. And it's very arbitrary. People being brought before a criminal court for small amount of drugs simply doesn't work. Doesn't work. If somebody can tell me how it actually does work, I'm all ears. But we've been all ears for the last 6 decades, and that doesn't work. So, I think a better system, Minister, is decriminalisation of the person. We're still in the kind of the paradigm of drugs being still illegal. You know, we're not talking about making things legal here in relation to this bill. You know, we're talking about decriminalisation of the person, and that's important. So, the kind of, I suppose, the elephant in the room, Minister, is the black market. The black market, which is hugely profitable, and the people that control the black market are the criminal gangs that are very violent, and they will use all sorts of intimidation in relation to communities across the country. But largely they control the black market. And you have this kind of ridiculous system that we have in place that control drugs that are supposed to be controlled by the state are not controlled by the state at all. They're controlled by the black market. So why allow that to happen? And why let that kind of vacuum still constantly exist in relation to this issue? So our bill, Minister, is very moderate. I understand that the government are putting a timed amendment in relation to that. And that's very disappointing, I have to say. Very disappointing. I mean, the ink is hardly dry on the Citizens' Assembly's report, and you're saying that there needs to be a timed amendment in relation to this. I mean, this is a test of the will of your government in relation to this issue. I'm not naive, Minister, right? I'm convinced there is, well, I know, there's members of your government that are bitterly opposed to the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. They want the status quo to exist. And even today, a number of doctors have come out in relation to trying to, you know, disinformation about the bill that we're putting. Our bill's not about legalisation, it's about decriminalising the person if they choose to use cannabis. These kind of doctors that have equated, yesterday, have equated 7 grams of cannabis to 4 bottles of vodka. Now hold on. 4 bottles of vodka will kill you. And not only kill you, it'll kill your family as well. You're talking about 4 grams or 7 grams of cannabis with 4 bottles of vodka. Are they joking, are they? Are they actually serious? So this is the kind of level of discourse and debate that we're kind of up against here. You know, these number of doctors want, obviously, the status quo to continue. That's what they're saying. And the status quo doesn't work. As I said, the Citizens' Assembly, the Justice Committee have stipulated that the status quo does not work, right? And the interpretation that most of us got from the Citizens' Assembly is that things need to move on through non-legislative kind of issues and legislative change around the Misuse of Drugs Act, because this is where it's all at in relation to that kind of that legislation. So it's not, as these doctors have stated, it's not anti-health by any means. We're pro-people. Anti-drugs laws, Minister, are anti-people. They've always been, you know, incarcerating people, criminalising people, stigmatising people. That's what the last 6 decades have been all about. So we want to kind of dismantle that. and we want to give people, you know, a choice, and we want to stop stigmatising people, stop kind of marginalising people, and give people a right to exist without criminal sanction. And that's what this bill is about today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Last Corla. And firstly, I really want to thank Gino for all the work he's done on this issue, on this bill. And those who have gone before him, I think Ming Flanagan is somewhere in the gallery, but also all the campaigners, many of whom are here, who have been pushing on this issue for a long time, trying to get us in the direction of social progress. I've been in here now almost 10 years, incredibly, and I think I've learned a thing or two about how the establishment politicians react to questions of social change. And there seems to be some things that are just like truisms. That is always the case. One is that they lag behind the population. Another is that if the opportunity presents itself to kick the can down the road, they will take it, they will kick that can as far as they possibly can. And third is that they adopt the language of change, of progress, well before, if they ever, actually adopt policies which represent progress and change. And unfortunately, all three are on display here from the reaction of the government and will be on display in the course of the debate. So it's clear the people are ahead of the politicians. That's what the Citizens' Assembly shows. Citizens' Assembly is very, very clear in terms of a proper health-led approach, in terms of decriminalisation. The Citizens' Assembly came within one vote of recommending legalisation of cannabis, which I think would be the right thing to do in terms of actually taking this out of the control of the criminal gangs, having proper state control and regulation and so on. But they're very clear in terms of decriminalisation, and yet the state is dragging its heels and the politicians are dragging their heels. Secondly, kicking the can down the road. That's what the government plans to do today. So you're going to have a timed amendment and the government's going to say very reasonably, sure, we have the Citizens' Assembly, we need to take time to consider the Citizens' Assembly, we need to take that time, and therefore let's just delay this and say it passes in 9 months' time. Well, what else happens in 9 months' time? I'll tell you what else happens in 9 months' time: a general election. Maybe in 10 months' time, 11 months' time, at most in 13 months' time. So what the government's amendment, if it passes, guarantees is that this bill is not going to pass before there's an election and before there's a new government. That's what the government's amendment is actually about, is avoiding taking a decision. All we're asking here is to take the decision, in principle, to say we're going to decriminalise the possession of small amounts of cannabis for personal use. That's all. It's a tiny step in the direction we need to go. It's nowhere near even the implementation of the full Citizens' Assembly recommendations, agreeing in principle today that this is the direction that we should go, and yet the government wants to kick the can down the road and not to do it. Thirdly, the rhetoric. I mean, it is interesting, and it's a sign of the pressure that the government is under, that for the last maybe 2 years or so, if you ask about drugs in here, the government comes back and says we're in favour of a health-led approach. We're in favour of a health-led approach. They've gotten the idea that this is the language to use. But there's no aspect of a health-led approach in terms of what the government actually does. What does a health-led approach look like? There's two aspects. One is stop criminalising people for taking drugs, and the other is invest in the health services, invest in tackling inequality, in tackling deprivation, in tackling trauma, invest in addiction services, invest in the health services to actually deal with problem drug use, drug abuse and drug addiction. But that's also not happening. So the government just has the language of a health-led approach while continuing with a war on drugs criminalisation type approach, proven by the fact that there's over 12,000 recorded offences for possession of an illicit drug for personal use in 2022. Possession of an illicit drug for personal use was 70% of all drug offences for 2022. And it was summed up by Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, being asked recently about an injection centre in Cork. And he made some kind of positive noises about being open for it. But then he raised what I think was meant to be some sort of profound question about the ethics of the state doing this, and would the state become responsible for people for what happened to them if they took drugs in an injection centre authorised by the state. Just like complete nonsense. He has to know it's complete nonsense. It has nothing to do with a health-led approach. Of course there's no obligation, no legal liability on the state or whatever. But again, it's just obfuscation, sitting on the fence, avoiding actually taking the change. To come to the basics very, very quickly, this is a question of whether we continue down the road of a failed war on drugs, or else recognise the reality that you will not stop people taking drugs as a result of criminalisation, and instead you need to invest in the services, in tackling inequality and so on, to make sure that you're allowing people to take drugs in a safe manner if they choose to do so, and minimising the dangers of drug abuse and drug addiction. We need to pass this. We need to reject the government amendment.
Thanks, Lascian Corla, and can I just commend Deputy Gino Kenny for his leadership on this critically important social issue in our society. And it is depressing, to be honest, the lack of leadership, the lack of courage of the government, that yet again they want to kick a key issue of social change and just recognising social reality down the road yet again, instead of doing the right thing. And particularly now, when you have the Citizens' Assembly having made the recommendations. I mean, while the wider issue, and we're very clear about this and straight up, we believe in the legalisation of drugs and the regulation of them. Because we think criminalisation has failed, and failed disastrously. Disastrously. It has done far more damage to our society than would legalising and regulating it properly. And it's doing it every single day. It is criminalising huge numbers of young people, effectively whole generations of young people, doing particular damage, that criminalisation, to some of the poorest and most deprived communities, to people who are medically vulnerable, people with mental health issues and so on. It is doing extraordinary damage. And critically, it has spawned a massive violent criminal underground that is a direct result of criminalisation. I mean, it is so obvious to me that if you criminalise something that huge numbers of our population do, whether you like that thing or not, then at a stroke, all of those people become criminals. Some of them will end up in prison, in court, enormous amount of police resources, of court resources, but even those who don't end up in court are operating in a criminal underworld, vulnerable to the criminals that run it and all that goes with that. And I mean, I don't know what the government are going to say in response to this. No doubt they will say that there, can be negative consequences of drug use, addiction, impacts on mental health, and so on. And I don't claim to be an expert, but I don't think there is a single thing that you could say about the adverse negative impact of cannabis use that you couldn't say 10 times over about alcohol use, which does far more damage to our society. Far more damage. But it would be a foolish government indeed who thought the answer to the problems with alcohol abuse, the violence, the domestic abuse, the addiction, who would say, let's criminalise it. Because of course that was tried and it was a disaster. It led directly to the growth of the mafia and the criminal underworld in the United States, for which the United States is still paying a very, very bitter price. Indeed, it glamorises, effectively, I mean, whatever you may think about it, it glamorises drug use as being part of a sort of mysterious criminal underworld. It is directly counterproductive. Even if your objective is to reduce drug use, and certainly all of us have the objective of reducing drug harm and addiction, it is directly counterproductive. It makes the situation far worse. It stigmatises people. It leaves people with criminal records that impact on the rest of their life in many cases, limits their life choices, and so on. And indeed, you could say many of the same things about prescription drugs, which are regulated. So it makes no sense whatsoever. And the government should cop on and show a bit of moral leadership and political leadership and allow this very, very modest bill. But we hope we can also open up that wider debate. The strategy of criminalisation and the strategy, frankly, of political cowardice has been a disastrous failure, and working class areas in particular, although not exclusively, have paid a bitter price for the criminalisation approach that this government and previous governments have followed. It has to end. The government has to wake up to reality.
Very much,
Last Corla, and I very much welcome the opportunity to update the. I very much welcome. Oh, sorry, I move.
Yeah,
thank you. So welcome the opportunity to update the Oireachtas with regard to drug policy and to highlight the progress that has been made in implementing the National Drug Strategy, reducing harm and supporting recovery. As we're all aware, misuse of illicit drugs affects every part of Irish society, whether urban or rural, disadvantaged or affluent. The misuse of drugs has devastating consequences, not only for the individual grappling with addiction, but also for their families and the communities where they live. We are all aware of the consequences: poor health and mental health outcomes for people in addiction, families torn apart, profiteering by unscrupulous gangs from the misery of others, drug-related intimidation in communities. And I appreciate that there are many challenges, but as Minister with responsibility for the National Drug Strategy, I'm committed to building on the progress already made. I have long held the view that we, as a society, have needed to have an open and honest conversation about drugs. Ensuring that the voices of those with lived experience and the voices of young people are heard is key to putting in place an appropriate response. As you are aware, last year the Government established the Citizens' Assembly to consider and make recommendations on the legislative policy and operation changes that the state could make to significantly reduce the harmful impact of illicit drugs on individuals, their families, communities and wider society. The report of the Citizens' Assembly was published last week and made 36 recommendations, including that the state introduces a comprehensive health-led response to drugs. This is a landmark report to assist in the further development of policy and drug use in Ireland. Choosing to have a Citizens' Assembly on drug use demonstrates the seriousness and gravity that government gives to this issue and its awareness of the impact of drugs on all corners and sections of our society. It also began the open and honest conversation which has been so badly needed and which will continue now in the Special Oireachtas Committee. There is an onus on government now to consider the deliberations of the Citizens' Assembly so that it can enhance the response to drug use from a policy, legislative and service delivery perspective. I am committed to leading on this response. I will actively engage with government colleagues and Oireachtas members on the responses to this report. But as we can see from the Assembly's report, drug misuse is a complex issue. There are no easy or straightforward solutions. I'm very clear we need more services to be provided and greater efforts must be made to prevent the use of drugs. That's why in 2024, I'm providing an additional €6 million for drug services to implement the National Drug Strategy. This brings the total new spend on drug services to €11.75 million since 2023. I also last year launched the first National Drug Prevention and Education Programme, which will fund 5 demonstration projects in school, community and nighttime social settings. People grappling with addiction face different challenges. Some may have the support of family, others may not. Some may be in employment, while others struggle to secure a job because of the nature of their illness. Access to education can also be an issue. The nature of addiction is different for each affected person. For example, there are people who not only have an addiction to drugs, but also struggle with their mental health. I have secured funding this year to help these people with a dual diagnosis, with a particular focus on younger people. And while I've secured additional funding to provide more treatment episodes for those in need, we know there are gaps in service provision. And that's why I've asked that an audit of services be completed so that we can ensure services are available where they're most needed. And just because someone has received treatment, it doesn't mean that they're in a position to lead a happy and productive life. That's why we're investing for the first time in recovery. The government is committed to taking a health-led approach to the use of illicit drugs in line with the recommendations set out in the Citizens' Assembly report. Nothing is served by jailing a person in addiction caught with drugs for personal use. And that is why I'm committed to introducing the Health Diversion Programme, which will connect people suffering from problematic drug use with the health services they need and provide a pathway to treatment and recovery. Harm reduction is a key component of the health-led approach to drug use, and that's why people can submit drugs at festivals for testing as part of a range of harm reduction initiatives under the Safer Nightlife programme, therefore helping people to avoid particularly risky drugs. That's why a medically supervised injecting facility will open this year to provide a safe space for people to inject drugs. And it's why the building and operation of the new 100-bed medical and addiction facility developed by Dublin Simon Community is being funded by government. With regard to the Private Members Bill, which has been brought forward by Deputy Kenny, and I thank you for that, Deputy, I note that the bill proposes to amend the Misuse of Drugs Act to enable a person who is at least 18 years of age to have possession for the person's personal use of either or both cannabis and cannabis resin that in each case does not exceed a specific amount and to provide for related matters. It's important that this proposal should be considered in the context of recommendation number 17 from the Citizens' Assembly, which is that the state introduces a comprehensive health-led response to drugs. This recommendation assumes that possession of controlled drugs would remain illegal, while those found in possession of drugs for personal use could be afforded extensive opportunities to engage with health-led services. Depending on how the legislation is designed, this approach would minimise or potentially completely remove the possibility of criminal conviction and prison sentences for simple possession. The Citizens' Assembly advises that there are several open questions about how Ireland might best legislate for a health-led model, combining diversion, decriminalisation and dissuasion. Given the important legal and constitutional issues to be considered, it is the responsibility of the Oireachtas, informed by legal advice and detailed pre-legislative scrutiny, to determine the most appropriate legal mechanisms to achieve this goal. The recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly will now be considered by the Oireachtas. It's anticipated that a special Oireachtas committee will be established to consider these recommendations and agree on the most appropriate next steps. In this context, debating the bill at this stage could undermine the work of a special Oireachtas committee. And in light of the above, it is the government's view that this bill is premature and should be deferred for a period of 9 months. Thank you.
Agus an issue Ashgoji people before Prophet Solidarity have to McBarry.
Bill is not premature, Minister. It's way, way overdue. And I think the majority of people in Irish society, the majority of young people, know that that is the case. But anyway, we'll get on and debate some of the issues here. So what are we debating? We're debating a very modest proposal. The proposal is that we decriminalise cannabis that is used for personal use, possession of cannabis for personal use. We're talking about small amounts. The bill stipulates 7 grams of cannabis or 2.5 grams of cannabis resin. the average joint would be in and around half a gram. So I'll give you an idea of what we're talking about. Now, the point has been raised in the discussion already. I'm going to repeat it. That in the year 2022, there were 12,136 recorded offences for possession of an illicit drug for personal use, and that constituted 70% of all drug offences. So, for the large number of those offences that related to cannabis possession, let's think a little bit about, what has happened here. First of all, when the person comes before the court, if they are found guilty under the Misuse of Drugs Act in the court, the normal thing would not be a conviction straight off the bat. The normal thing, most judges on most days will say, make a donation to the charity box. What would the donation be? Donations are not small. €400, €500. It would be a week's take-home pay for many young workers. So you avoid the criminal record if you're prepared to cough up the bobs. You might not be so lucky if you had bought the drug and shared the drug with other people. For example, even if you shared the drug with your partner. There was a court case related to that recently. Certainly, if you'd bought, not a large quantity of the drug, but you gave it or you sold it to your friends, you're not a big-time drug dealer or anything like that, on a given day, a judge might consider that in a more serious light and might convict. Now, what does a conviction mean for someone in that situation? For one, it'll certainly affect their employment prospects. There are many companies that simply ain't going to hire you, no way. It can affect your chances of travel, to get a visa, to travel to another country. I'll give you one example that's a very nearby example here. In the gallery today, we have Martin from Cork. Martin campaigns for sensible drug policy, campaigns for the legalisation of cannabis. He would be seen as an authoritative spokesperson for that point of view. And as such, he was to attend the United Nations Special Assembly on Narcotics in 2016. He couldn't do it. Why? He couldn't get a visa to get into the United States because of the drugs conviction that he had because of our antiquated laws here. And that's even before I talk about the effect that a conviction might have on the mental health of a person. Now, what happens before the person ends up in the court? Well, they've been stopped and searched. We don't know how many people have been stopped and searched in any given year. The Gardaí do not make a log of all the searches that take place. The Central Statistics Office have criticised the quality of the data that the Gardaí have in these instances. Receipts are issued, but only when drugs are found. So how many stop and searches do we have in this state in any given year? I mean, if 12,000 people plus is the number of recorded offences, there's plenty of stop and searches where there's no drugs found or no drugs to be found. So if it's 2 searches for every one that becomes a recorded offence, that's 24,000 stop and searches. If it's 3, it's 36,000. If it's 5, it's 60,000. And part of this debate has to be the fact, and I can't back it up with stats because the guards don't provide the stats, but I know it to be the case, that there is a disproportionate number of people of colour who are stopped and searched, particularly young people, and a disproportionate number of people from lower income working class areas. No comparison compared with the amount of stopping and searching that goes on in middle class areas, including middle class areas that might be not too far away. How much Garda time and how much of the resources of the state is spent with this nonsensical round the mulberry bush game? Well, let's see. The guard has to stop the person, search the person. They have to go back to the station and do the paperwork. When the file comes back from the DPP, there's more paperwork to be done. They have to send out correspondence. It might be registered letter. It might be calling to the house and delivering. If the person is not there, might have to call a second time. And that's before we even look at the court time. I mean, the idea that a guard steps into a court at 10 o'clock in the morning, the case is heard, and he's out the gap by half past 10. I'm sure it happens. I'd say it's rare enough. Quite common to spend a morning in court, not uncommon to spend a day in court. Now, if you want to argue that, you know, those resources stay with the Gardaí, I think if you had community control over the Gardaí, democratic control over the Gardaí by communities, you'd get rid of that nonsense and say there's far more valuable things that the Guards could be doing to provide a service in our community. If you wanted the resources not to be with the Gardaí but to be with the state, what could be done in terms of investment in mental health services, youth workers, social workers, with the money and time that is wasted in that exercise? I deliberately haven't gone into too much stuff about medicinal arguments because I think the arguments are broader than the medicinal arguments. But the medicinal arguments are still very much part of this debate. In a district court in West Cork earlier this year, a 64-year-old man, a multiple cancer survivor, a man who had experienced organ failure, who had had both hips and a knee replaced, and who had suffered a stroke, came in front of the court for growing cannabis and possession of cannabis. At one stage, this man had been 13 or 14 stone. Because of the illnesses, the cancers, he was down at one point to 7 stone. A person that he knew gave him some cannabis. All right, as the person said, that'll give you the munchies, that'll get you your weight back up. He tried it one night, woke up in the middle of the night, and the person said he was hungry enough to eat a horse. And the weight went back up. It was a very, very useful thing for that person. The man was fined €300. He was given a 3-month suspended sentence and subject to random testing over, I stand to be corrected, I think it's the next 3 years. Certainly it's a significant period of time. In other words, if you use cannabis again, you're off to jail. And we have ministers come in here and talk about, you know, the state now needs to take up a health-led approach. Well, that's what's going on while these cliches are being trotted out. In conclusion, Chair, the war on drugs has not worked. It's a complete failure. We need to legalise and have democratic control over drug supply. We need to legalise cannabis. Our people who argue against it say it's a gateway drug. Start taking cannabis, you'll be on to heroin and who knows what next. There's no medical argument to back that up, but there is a social argument. You buy your cannabis from your drug dealer, sells it to you this week, sells it to you this month. Next year, he says, would you like to try something else? It's the government's policy and the state's policy which makes cannabis a gateway drug in that way. This is an important issue. It shouldn't be kicked down the road. We should vote for this to go ahead tonight.
Thank you, Deputy. Now we'll move on to the Sinn Féin and Deputy Paya Daly, Thomas Gould, Donncha O'Leary, Martin Brown, Paul Donnelly, Mark Ward, Rory O'Murco. And I'm asking that you all mind your own time, because when the time is up, it's up. So I'm just telling you that before you start. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and I'd like to thank the People Before Profit for introducing this bill. And clearly a new way is needed for the state's drug policy, and the report of the Justice Committee last year recommended that a policy of decriminalisation be pursued in line with emerging international best practice, in respect of the possession of drugs for personal consumption through appropriate legislation reform in favour of a health-led approach to problem drug use. And the final report of the Citizens' Assembly was split, and it doesn't go so far as to say that possession is totally decriminalised or that Misuse of Drugs Act should be repealed, but it gives the decision back to the Oireachtas, saying that possession of controlled drugs would remain illegal. Changes are likely to be required to the Misuse of Drugs Act in conjunction with the enhanced use of probation, etc. New legislation may also be required. And in my view, an overhaul of the Misuse of Drugs Act is probably necessary. The Citizens' Assembly views it, goes on to say that as the responsibility of the Oireachtas, informed by legal advice and detailed pre-ledged scrutiny, to determine the most appropriate legal mechanisms. And my own personal view is that the consequences of criminalising mostly younger men is vastly disproportionate to the act which has led to the charge. Potentially career-ending consequences and limitations on travel from even a charge which is unproven or does not result in a conviction being applied is not the fairest or most just way to deal with people smoking cannabis. And I saw in my own career people being charged with pieces left on a grinder, traces of cannabis with less than even 1 gram. And my experience has been that this system often led to young, often vulnerable men being pressurised then into providing information on potentially dangerous individuals to avoid a charge or conviction. And this at least causes further stress. And mention was made of the powers under the Misuse of Drugs Act in relation to detention, and you can have no other conclusion that it is often used in a random fashion. For years, the offence of simple possession was excluded from the adult caution scheme, but even since it was included, the amount of charges remain high. My figures are that there was 5,900 for the year 2021. I hadn't seen the 2022 figures, but I'd be interested in looking at those. However, at the same time, I have met people, family members, who say that as a result of taking drugs and the increased potency of cannabis, that there is a danger to young people, again, particularly to young men. So one-size-fits-all approach cannot succeed. And this bill proposes to amend Section 3 to make the possession of up to 7 grams of cannabis lawful, provided that the circumstances were such that a reasonable inference can be drawn that the drugs were for the personal use of the individual. In Section 3 of this bill, it places the burden of proof strangely on the defendant then rather than the state. Now, last year, the Supreme Court struck down some other laws which placed the onus of proof on the defendant. So it's a very tricky area, and placing the onus on the defendant means obviously that they're already before the court and may be obliged to give evidence. And any further inroads into the right to silence should be approached with extreme caution, in my view. However, the amount suggested of 7 grams seems comparable to international comparisons. Malta, for instance, uses a similar yardstick, but what is more problematic may be the reasonable inference. Could it be more prudent for the bill to say that no prosecution would be initiated or maintained if the amount is below a certain amount and there is no evidence that the person is dealing, rather than saying that it shall be lawful? So I'm wondering, is this a proposed defence, or is it a request or command to the DPP not to prosecute? This can all be teased out later. So one suggests that no proceedings should be brought, and then another suggests that in proceedings for the amount that the onus is on a defendant to prove something. Another potential issue is that in one section of the bill, and to amend Section 3, it says that a person over the age of 18 years. So I'm just wondering, how does it apply to somebody who's 17 years old? The bill, in my view, clearly is not the finished product. And Sinn Féin has approached this debate with an open mind and see if the issues, both positive and negative, can be teased out at committee stage. A special Oireachtas committee has been recommended. As legislators, it's now our job to listen to the decision of the Citizens' Assembly to implement solutions. And on this point, our wider consideration is just the criminal law. And my colleagues, Deputy Gould and Deputy Ward, have also undertaken extensive work in the field of mental health, rehabilitation, the treatment of addiction. And the current legislative framework is far from perfect, but we need to see health impact and other assessments. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Jonathan O'Leary, fine, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. I welcome the opportunity to speak on this legislation today. I understand that this bill addresses many of the issues that extend beyond addiction and have been well addressed by Deputy Daly. As the Sinn Féin spokesman for addiction recovery and wellbeing, I feel it is vitally important to speak for those in the sector who's actively experience the harmful impact of addiction, both individuals in active addiction, their loved ones and their communities. Addiction services in this state at the government level have stalled. While those on the ground are working tirelessly, we are faced with funding for task force that doesn't even match the levels of 2010. We have the 3 largest cities have no supervised injection facilities, and research undertaken by my office indicates that we have a shortage of 558 residential treatment beds, 93 detox beds and 161 step-down beds. These gaps are leaving people waiting for over 6 months for treatment in some cases, and despite the huge work that's being done by those in the sector, the government are leaving people fall through the cracks. It is Sinn Féin's belief that a health-led approach to addiction means closing the gap, providing funding for localised responsive services. We believe that Fine Gael will never make these changes, and that Fianna Fáil and the Green Party have turned a blind eye to the addiction sector and their huge failings. And all this happened under austerity, and it's still here today. For too long, those in addiction, their families and communities have been the black sheep of Irish society. We believe today's bill should have given people an opportunity to discuss it, but the government's amendment now to kick this down the road, to prevent the conversation, to prevent votes taking place is wrong. And to finally, the point I would say here, if we're really serious about change, we must fund addiction services, rehabilitation services, because if we don't fund them, those in addiction and recovery will not get the supports they need.
Thank you, Deputy.
I want to thank people for Profit Solidarity and all those who have worked with them to bring forward this bill. I think it is a reasonable proposition, worthy of discussion, and I welcome the fact that we can have a discussion on it. We will not be opposing this bill. We think it should proceed to committee stage, and we have long called for an increased emphasis on harm reduction in this area. And my colleague Deputy Gould and Deputy Daly have undertaken extensive work in the fields of mental health, rehabilitation and the treatment of addiction. We do want to see a health-led approach to drug addiction. It serves no one, neither the individual who is caught in addiction nor society itself, to treat this person as a criminal and the knock-on effects this has, such as restricting an individual from future employment opportunities, such as stigmatisation, such as clogging up the criminal justice system. And the amount being discussed here is quite a small amount, 7 grams. And I think, in such a context, if we're talking about a health-led approach, I think it is at this level that I think we should certainly be looking at it. As a society, we need to change our approaches. It is a discussion that is happening. I don't think delaying it serves anyone. We supported the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs and noted recommendations for a wider health-based approach, moving away from the use of an overburdened criminal justice system. We don't want to see people criminalised and jailed for possession of very small amounts of drugs for their personal use. We are also conscious of the fact, and there needs to be a balance struck in relation to this. Many communities that we represent are burdened by exploitative and parasitic criminal gangs at times, and that is the case in our major cities. That's the case across the country. We do not want to see that any legislation be open to exploitation by criminal gangs. However, I suppose the focus of this legislation is on the individual person and not seeing them brought before the courts unnecessarily, and huge implications for the rest of their lives, and indeed it spills into things such as housing applications as well. There are, as Deputy Daly has identified, things that need to be teased out in the legislation, and I also note the point made by Deputy Daly and Deputy Gould. Beyond this legislation, obviously legislation can't deal with all the issues. There needs to be a serious addressing of the shortfall of rehabilitation beds, but that's obviously not something that you can deal with in legislation. The technical issues that Deputy Daly has raised are worthy of attention, but they can be dealt with at committee stage and should not be delayed.
Deputy Martin Brown.
I'd also like to thank Deputy Kenny for bringing this bill forward. Progressive bills like this enable us to have a debate in which we consider drug use and possession of various kinds in our society is to be welcomed. It is clear that the current response to drug use and drug possession needs a reform. How that reform is approached and structured is complex and has a fundamental importance from health, rehabilitation and criminal justice viewpoints. This bill focuses on a particular aspect of reforming the current system, that is to allow for legal possession of no more than a specific amount of cannabis or cannabis resin. When he introduced this bill, the Deputy spoke of having a mature discussion on this and was critical of the criminalisation of people for the possession of small amounts of drugs. I agree with him that both these points need to be addressed. And as a party, we don't want to see people criminalised and jailed for possession of small amounts of drugs for their personal use, especially in light of the implications this can have from a personal perspective, as well as in the criminal justice system. That is the value of debates prompted by bills such as this, and of course by the convening of forums such as the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs, which incidentally recommended a health-based approach to be taken, moving away from the use of an overburdened criminal justice system. I note that the Government has tabled an amendment to defer progress in this bill until the House has had the opportunity to consider the report of the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs. Frankly, given the fact that open discussion very much prevails in light of the Citizens' Assembly, its report, and in anticipation of the establishment of the Special Oireachtas Committee, I don't really see the point in delaying a particular discussion or debate when it is so relevant. As I said, these are discussions that need to happen. Drugs policy needs to be informed through research, debate, drawn on the experience and often open discussion. Delaying bills as this stifles that debate, in my opinion. Specifically on this bill, there are issues that need to be examined in the justice and health areas, and we need to examine the experience of other jurisdictions where cannabis was legalised. I would like to see this bill given further scrutiny at committee level, but in light of the Government's amendment, it appears this bill will now be delayed, which is regrettable, as the progress that is being made in the examination of current and any future drug policy should not be interrupted by delaying bills like this.
I'd like to also thank Deputy Gino Kenny for bringing forward this bill today. I know I've said this before, and I think it needs to be said again and again. The so-called war on drugs has utterly failed to achieve those objectives and has caused untold damage to our communities. How do we know? Because we see it in our streets, we see it in our communities, in our pubs, our clubs. In fact, pretty much anywhere we go, there are signs of drug use. And I'm not talking about the most devastating, the most destructive and abused drug in our country, that legal drug called alcohol. And I note earlier on the comments in relation to the attempt to criminalise that many years ago. I'm disappointed the Government has decided to kick the can further down the road. We need to now move forward, debate, discuss, tease out what it means, how this approach actually impacts in our community on the ground. I look forward to that debate, and I look forward to a radical change in our approach to the use of drugs in this state. But there are things that we can do now to support our communities. We can get back to putting the community back in its rightful place as a core member of the drug strategy and to end the isolation of the community sector in the national drug strategy. We can ensure that those delivering the health-led services are fully resourced to deal with problematic drug use. Many of those projects on the front line have still not recovered from the devastating effects of the cuts during the austerity years. We can resource mental health services for people with mental health issues. I have no doubt that the increased potency of weed has been sold to very young people, and that's very young people, is having a serious effect on their mental health. We believe that while we have some specific concerns as outlined by Deputy Daly, it should be allowed to pass the committee to give it further scrutiny. The time for discussing this is now. We have, as we've seen in the debates in the Citizens' Assembly, that there is very strong support for a different approach, a health-led approach, and a change in legislation about how we deal with people and how people are criminalised and jailed for relatively small use of drugs. So I would certainly urge that the Government would change their opinion on this and would allow this to move forward so that we can deal with this as a country, as a community, in a proper way. Good morning.
Deputy Mark Ward.
I also want to thank my constituency colleague, Deputy Gino Kenny, for the opportunity to discuss this issue, and I also want to add my disappointment to the government who have kicked this bill down the road and denied us the opportunity to discuss this further at committee stage. We could have heard about this bill and consequences and positives of this bill in a more balanced way. For too long, many of our young people have been convicted for simple possession of cannabis, and this could lead to a lifetime of effects, be that for travel or be that for employment. And young people from disadvantaged areas are disproportionately affected by this as well. I also want to note that the Citizens' Assembly did not call to legalise cannabis. What they stated that while the possession of cannabis would remain illegal, people found in possession will be afforded the opportunity to engage with health-led services. And while this theory, which is very similar to the Portuguese model, would work in theory, in practice, if it was introduced tomorrow, it wouldn't work. And the reason for that is for successive governments underfunding of addiction and rehabilitation services. I've worked in frontline addiction services right across Dublin, and I've seen at first hand how difficult it is for services that I've worked in and managed to access the funding that our communities vitally need. There's also a narrative being put on that cannabis is a harmless drug with little or no short-term consequences. In one drug service that I managed, and I know Deputy O'Riordan, as Minister in time responsible for drugs, visited the service. The majority of the young people that were accessing the service were young men between the ages of 16 and 25. Many had left school, lost jobs, become involved in criminality, lost family relationships, and owed out huge amount of drug debts. This was very similar to the heroin epidemic in the 80s. But this time, the only drug that these young people were using was cannabis. Cannabis has been modified over the years to increase the THC levels, to reduce the CBD levels, which has led to increased potencies and has led to a range of negative impacts, including the impact on mental health. We've seen many young people experiencing psychosis for the first time because of the potency of cannabis. And this issue, as I said, and other issues like this, Minister, could have been discussed at committee stage, but again, the government have kicked it down the road and denied us the opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Rory O'Murco, 2.5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, and I think at least we have agreement on one thing, that Just Say No and the war on drugs has been an absolute abject failure. I remember in Dundalk a couple of years ago, and there was a period, following cuts as regards the Gardaí, that we didn't have a drug squad. Then suddenly we had a drug squad, and in fairness, no one's going to have a problem when action is taken against dangerous criminals that obviously have our communities in serious bother, in serious pressure. They have their foot on their neck. And I remember a former superintendent saying, no, it's brilliant, but I could do it. I could do it 50 guards. I could do it 100 guards working specifically in drugs. And then he turned around and, in fairness to him, he said, but here, show me a place where policing has actually worked, where we've been able to actually out-police this. So I think that's the logic of where we're at. And I think this is a failure, that we don't allow this piece of legislation to go forward and that we don't have a real conversation. Because, look, we can talk about a health-led strategy, we can talk about a harm reduction strategy, but we actually need to enact it at some point in time. And that's not to take away from the fact that, of course, there are issues in relation to cannabis and the increased levels of THC. Of course, we've seen that, the issues in relation to psychosis. We've also seen the issues of the state and services which don't allow for dual diagnosis in relation to mental health services, so people are kept on the outside. We have no means of dealing with people when they are actually in disastrous circumstances. And we're also dealing with the reality that the fact is all these drugs are being dealt. That's cannabis, that's cocaine, that's whatever. We have to look at all of it. And we know that the people who suffer the most are those in working class areas. We know that there's a significant overlap in relation to poverty that needs to be addressed. We also know that a huge amount of money that goes to drug gangs actually comes from middle class people who take cocaine. And we need different solutions across the board in relation to all of this. But if we're not going to fund addiction services, and the Minister met with the Family Addiction Support Network in Dundalk, supported supported by the guards but facing closure. We know Turris needed to self-fund their own dual diagnosis project, and we know the Red Door project in Drogheda has also been under significant issues. But here, we need to get absolutely real. And in fairness to Deputy Kenny, when he spoke about the 4 litres of vodka, not only would that kill you, it's absolutely legal to take it down the street at the minute. And I think we all know we all shouldn't take, nobody should be taking drugs. Probably a lot of us would be better off if we didn't take alcohol.
Thank you, Deputy. Aidan O'Reilly has 8 minutes. The Labour Party.
First of all, I want to thank Gino Kenny, who consistently brings this issue to the floor of this House. We need more politicians to show the leadership of Gino Kenny, and indeed those in the gallery here today, to say to you that you're going to change this country for the better with your advocacy and your support for bills like Gino has brought today. I'm at this minister for about 10 years. About 10 years ago, I was sat down by Anna Quigley of Citywide, who told me what decriminalisation all meant. And she said it's not about the decriminalisation of drugs as much as it's about decriminalisation of people. And what this debate really is about, it's actually about people more than it is about drugs. Just for the record, we absolutely support this bill. The Labour Party believes in decriminalisation of the drug user, in the legalisation and regulation of cannabis as well. So why is it about people, and why don't we get anywhere? It's because the institutions of the state, those status quo warriors, don't like the people that this affects. They just don't like them. I've often said that if the number of cattle in Ireland died from an overdose the same rate as people died of drugs, we'd have a national conversation, everything would be shut down, there'd be emergency cabinet meetings. But because we just don't like the people who take drugs, that's why we don't do anything about it. And that's why, you know, we have a situation where you can use dehumanising, derogatory terminology about people who take drugs all the time and never be called up on it. Because those who are primarily affected by this issue are disproportionately people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So disproportionately migrants, they're disproportionately people from the LGBT community, they're disproportionately people with disabilities. Why? Because they're seeking connection. Because what we don't like talking about is trauma, hurt, abuse. Things within inside ourselves that we find something to use to connect. Right? But we don't like talking about all those things. And we dehumanise and we denigrate those who take drugs, and we do anything we can to stop the discussion about the person. So let's talk about the people. It's been mentioned that there was 12,000 charges there in 2022. That's about 6,400 people were put in front of our courtroom and accused by the state for being in possession of something that they were going to use themselves. I was Minister for Drugs at one point. I was encouraged to go down to the drug court. This is kind of progressive. It has a different approach. I went down to the drug court, I sat in the back bench, and all I saw was a court full of poor, sick people. Poor, sick people don't belong in a courtroom. 70% of our drug cases in our courts are for possession for personal use. What an absolute waste of Garda time. It is a complete and utter waste of Garda time, because what it's actually about is a war on people. It's not a war on drugs. It's a war on the people who take drugs. And it's a total misunderstanding of the nature of addiction. If we just ban this stuff, people will stop taking it. And we'll just arrest the people who take it and everything will be fine. Because our society believes, these status quo warriors believe that they're just not powerful enough to do anything about it. And then we witnessed it. I witnessed it on Saturday myself. I was walking through town, top of Talbot Street, 2 guards searching a young fella. How demonstrative, how in plain sight. They were, they were sort of demonstrating to the world that this person has no power, and I can do this to this person because it's about drugs. But it's not actually about the drug, it's about the person that we don't like. That's what it showed to me. And, a Cathaoirleach newsflash, people in every walk of life, people from all over the country, people in every income bracket, people in politics, people in journalism, people in the judiciary, people in the guards take drugs, but they don't end up in court. Because this is actually a point about social justice. The people who end up in front of the courts are those who society feels don't have power. So this is actually a discussion about power and about people. And do we really think, honestly, that we're going to affect a person's life for the better by giving them a criminal charge? Are we genuinely thinking that giving a young person or a person of any age who is taking something for their own personal use a criminal charge that's going to correct their behaviour? What you're more likely to do is to make that person less trust the state. Trust the state less. Trust the agencies of the state less. To separate themselves from the state and actually to find themselves more in the clutches of the gangs and the people who are peddling this stuff. I mean, if you're a young person, late teens, early 20s, and you find yourself in court, are you going to have a positive view of the guards, a positive view of the judicial system, a positive view of society? Or are you going to double down on this behaviour of yours and make a particular life choice at that point in time? This policy of ours of criminalisation, it's making a lot of people rich and it's making a lot of people miserable. And it's not working. But it only continues to work because the people it affects are disproportionately poorer, disproportionately less powerful. And I know what happens in Middle Ireland, where people are horrified by politicians using words such as decriminalisation. What we're actually talking about here is people. And I wish those people who are horrified by politicians such as perhaps Gino Kenny, myself, and Gary Gannon and others who are talking about this would actually realise that it's all around you. It's in your community, it's in your family. The hypocrisy of this debate is stunning. There is addiction in every single family in Ireland. The question fundamentally is, if somebody in your family had an addiction issue or had a drug use issue, who would you call if you loved that person in your family? Who would you ring? Would you ring a guard first? Or would you ring a counsellor or a nurse or a doctor first? But clearly all of us would want to ring somebody who might help and show that person compassion. So let's be clear what the Labour Party wants. We want, actually, when it comes down to it, the legalisation and regularisation of cannabis. Let's realise that this drug is actually an awful lot less harmful than the drug which is legal, which costs the state about $3.8 billion a year, which is a contributory factor in abuse, in violence, in drink driving debt, and antisocial behaviour, which is alcohol, which is perfectly legal. And we need to wise up and think fundamentally about the people affected by this issue, who maybe not be, who heretofore we didn't think were powerful enough. But I think now the gallery today will demonstrate to all of us just how people affected by this or who care about this are finding their power and finding their voice.
Thank you. Deputy Gary Gannon, 8 minutes.
Yeah, I want to thank Deputy Kenny for his work on this bill, but also for the advocacy on the issue and the heart which he brings to it. It's incredibly welcome. And of course, the Social Democrats, we will be supporting it. For many years, the Social Democrats have favoured a health-based approach to drugs, and this is why we believe a policy of decriminalisation should be pursued in respect to the possession of drugs for personal use. Therefore, it was welcome the report of the Citizens' Assembly on drug use also reflects this position, but amongst others, its recommendation that a comprehensive health-led response should be implemented. Now it is incumbent upon the Government to urgently establish a special Oireachtas committee to examine these recommendations and bring forward legislative proposals. This is not a time for hand-wringing, nor is it a time for dithering. Political leadership is required to call a halt to the criminalisation of addiction. We know that turning people with addiction issues into criminals only serves to demonise them and deny them future opportunities. This is particularly true of communities with high levels of deprivation and disadvantage who are disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of drug use. The relationship between poverty and drug-related harm is well established, but it is not enough to just recognise this fact. We must act upon it. However, while decriminalisation should be part of a radically different approach to drug use, it must also be accompanied by a comprehensive plan to tackle poverty and to tackle deprivation. Such a plan must include improved community infrastructure to mitigate against the negative impacts of poverty and social exclusion. An example of this would be front-loading infrastructure when developing housing so that we do not create communities of deprivation. At the sharp end of drug-related issues is the homelessness crisis. 11% of drug-related deaths from poisoning in 2020 occurred in homeless accommodation. While this government pays lip service to the solutions, such as the Finnish housing first model, the housing crisis it's presiding over and fuelling makes it all but impossible to implement them. In terms of health, while the evidence indicates that decriminalisation helps reduce the health risks associated with drug use, it alone cannot achieve significant reduction. Any legislative change must occur in tandem with a range of other responses. This includes timely and adequate inpatient and outpatient addiction services. Such services must be supportive, not punitive, to allow those who continue to use drugs or relapse to retain access to these services. The lack of mental health supports and services in our community must also be addressed if we are to tackle the underlying causes of problem drug use. After all, we know that drug use is often just a way of self-medicating to cope with mental issues and trauma. Harm reduction should also be a key goal of any health-led approach to drug use. While it is very welcome that the country's first medically supervised drug injection facility has been given the go-ahead, there is clearly a need for time. There's no timeline, and we need more than one facility. I acknowledge the sensitivities around their location, but research from other countries has consistently shown that supervised injection facilities do not make communities more unsafe or lead to increased drug-related use. Another area of huge concern is the funding situation within the community and voluntary sector dealing with drug use. A significant increase in funding to local drug and alcohol task forces is required to meet the growing demand for services. According to local drug and alcohol task force data, between 2012 and 2021, the number of people using the services rose by almost 40%. Further analysis shows that while the numbers in receipt of treatment for alcohol addiction has only increased by 5%, there has been a 60% increase in those undertaking treatment for drugs. Along with more resources, local task forces should have greater input into national policies as they are best placed to identify emerging trends. The crucial role of community drug projects must also be built on. Government should engage with those projects to develop and put in place an efficient, reliable and sustainable funding arrangement that reflects the value of the work they do in their communities. There are, of course, different models of decriminalisation across approximately 30 jurisdictions worldwide, and while the Citizens' Assembly report calls for decriminalisation, it is not prescriptive in this regard. Instead, the report asks several key questions, including whether sanctions for possession should be removed entirely from existing legislation. Ultimately, there are a number of different approaches to decriminalisation, but it's highly likely that some changes to the Misuse of Drug Act will be required. The Oireachtas must answer these questions, and that is why a special Oireachtas committee is needed. The bill before us could also be considered in that context. The committee must be established without delay. Otherwise, lives will continue to be ruined and lost under a system that criminalises what we know to be a health issue. Given the history of the state, we should know better than to allow moral judgment to be the basis for social policy.
Matt Shanahan, 8 minutes.
And my apologies, I've just come from committee, so I'm not going to take 8 minutes, Chair, but maybe if I can just point out some points. Firstly, I would like to pay tribute to Deputy Kenny. I think he has been the foremost voice, I'd say, in the chamber since his arrival here in terms of looking for a revised drug strategy from government. And I would not question in any way his bona fides, which I think stand large and tall in terms of his concern for those who have fallen into addiction and the need to try and receive rehabilitation and access to state support services to try and get them back, I suppose, playing a greater role in society, but also to stand them up and restore some dignity to their lives. Drug addiction is a scourge, and I think we have to be careful in terms of legislation that we're proposing as to whether or not we are potentially opening up avenues that might increase that vista rather than reduce it. But in terms of the bill that's being proposed here today, I think we have to listen to a citizens' assembly who have looked at this, and I think we do want to decriminalise the possession, particularly of Class A drugs. And I made the point to someone recently, a family that I know, that their son was found in possession of a small amount of drug at 18 years of age. I don't know why he ended up getting a conviction, but he did. And the problem after that was he was quite good at sport and could not travel to the US because he's barred from getting a visa there because of that conviction. So criminalising people for this is not the way forward, and I think government has actually probably made mention of that in recent days. I would like to say, Chair, that one of the big deficits that we have in the country at present is how we deal with the social problems that people are facing. And I think we try to throw money at problems, not really understanding how they come about. And I am close to Ashari in Waterford, and I want to commend the work that is done by that organisation. And they see a lot of people who are, I would say, have family trauma. And that is a road, without a doubt, into drug addiction. And that is a societal problem. It is very hard to get at the nubs of it. There's so many reasons for it, but certainly impoverishment is one of the main ones, and a lack of access to education, to mentoring, to role models. And I think that's why community groups are so important, why sports clubs are so important in community, and why young people need to have something to aim for. They need to have people in their lives who can give them direction and I suppose, give them a sense of well-being, a sense of confidence, a sense of self-esteem, that they can participate in life even if they have started from a very low base. And I think we would all aspire to that. In terms of where this legislation might go, I would point out, and there is a lot of medical evidence to suggest that cannabis and cannabis resin is not the drug it was 20, 30 years ago. In my younger days, I lived in America for a while. I had two acquaintances there who started on cannabis in their late teens, and one of those has sadly died from heavy heroin addiction, and the other has been battling a cocaine addiction for a number of years. So it can be a gateway drug, but more importantly, I think the potency of cannabis has been highlighted by many members of the medical profession, and we are seeing a lot more children in the psychiatric services who have psychosis and psychotic episodes as a result of using cannabis. So it is not a benign drug by any means, and neither, by the way, are prescription drugs that are abused, and that is also a problem. But in the round, Chair, I want to, as I say, congratulate Deputy Kenny on what he is trying to achieve here. I think we do have to make this a public health, as has been said. This is a public health problem. It is not a criminal problem. When we do have the problem with drugs, in terms of we have a lot of people who are making a lot of money out of the drug industry in this country, and we have a lot of social deprivation because of drug addiction. And anything that can be done in terms of trying to remediate that, anything that can be done to try and offer greater supports to people, particularly people who are challenged in our community, to either keep them away from drugs, and where they happen to fall into that position, to try and get them off, particularly hard drugs. And we do not want to create addiction. Addiction is the greatest marketing plan, the cheapest marketing plan that any company anywhere could introduce. And I think we do have to make people aware of the dangers of it. But I understand there are some people, and maybe it is their right, and it is certainly in other European countries, if they want to dabble in Class A drugs. It's not something that I would choose to do, but then I do drink alcohol, so who am I to talk? So, Chair, in the round, I support Deputy Kenny and the work that he's trying to do in the chair.
Thank you, Deputy. We'll move on now to the rural independent groups, and first speaker, Deputy Collins.
Chairperson. The proposed bill seeks to modify the Misuse of Drugs Act 1977, allowing adults to legally possess a specified amount of cannabis or cannabis resin for personal use. This initiative to amend the law commenced over a year ago, and there are no legal obstacles to the amendment. In Ireland, drugs use has been on the rise since data collection began nearly 2 decades ago. Cannabis use contributes to a variety of health issues, including drug-related health problems, the social problems arising from the operation of the illicit drug market have also been recognised in Ireland since the 1990s. The proposed bill, while aiming to reduce criminal charges and potentially bring economic benefits, could inadvertently contribute to these ongoing issues. It should worry us all, for instance, that cocaine use in Ireland has been on the rise, with the country having the highest usage of cocaine in the European Union in 2022. There was a 4.8% prevalence of cocaine use in Ireland in people aged 15 to 34. The Health Research Board study found that cocaine use among males has risen to nearly 1 in 10 for the 25 to 35-year-old group age. I do believe that there is an area that we should be talking about, and that is the medicinal use for drugs, where they can benefit people, and we have seen that. Over the past few years, we had the medicinal cannabis, which I have to use the name of Vera Toomey, who soldiered and fought a huge battle to get medicinal cannabis for her daughter Eva, who has since passed away, God rest her soul, a beautiful child. But that woman's astounding battle opened up the mindsets of many people in this country, including myself, to the benefits of a medicinal use drug. A medicinal use drug, nothing else but a medicinal use drug. And if people like other people like Vera Toomey can continue this fight, I can certainly think we can open a lot of our eyes going forward.
I welcome the opportunity to speak on this issue, and I acknowledge the work of Deputy Gino Kenny in bringing it forward. While I certainly accept that Deputy Kenny is motivated by what he believes is the best approach to this issue, I have to say that I cannot support the aim of this bill, which is to make it legally permissible for a person to possess up to a stated amount of cannabis resin for adult personal use. I accept that we should have a lenient approach to persons in the throes of addiction, but effectively removing all legal sanction for possession of what remains a very dangerous drug is something that I cannot support. However, as a study carried out by researchers by the Department of Psychiatry, RCSI and Beaumont Hospital found, cannabis use during youth is of great concern, as the developing brain may be particularly susceptible to harm during this period. We also know from research that when 1,600 Australian children aged between 14 to 15 years of age were studied for 7 years, the ones who used cannabis every day were 5 times more likely to become depressed and anxious by the end of the study. What I want to see is more emphasis on drug use, prevention and avoidance. I want to end this by highlighting once again my contribution. I want to end my contribution here by highlighting that my own counties of Offaly and Laois are profoundly under-resourced when it comes to tackling illegal drugs. As I understand it, there's just one Garda member assigned to the Laois Offaly Drug Division unit. And indeed, my constituency's local drugs unit had fewer Gardaí assigned to them than any other unit in this country, and that is unacceptable and needs to change.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Cahill. I'm glad to get the opportunity to say a few words on this. And I welcome the debate, but sadly I can't support this motion here today. Because I worry so much about the evidence of drugs and what it's doing to youngsters, lovely young boys and girls, and the way families are broke up and people finish up in bad health. And we can see that it has been on the rise for nearly 2 decades now, and it's the stepping stone to have the drugs. While they tell you, some of the people in favour that it's not a serious or bad drug in itself, but it's the gateway and the stepping stone to harder drugs. And then I have heard the medical profession saying that there are more people affected adversely by cannabis than any other drug, because there's more of it being used. And sure, you, Deputy Ring, as me in Kerry, in Mayo and everywhere, it's on the rise in every little town and hamlet and parish, and we see the devastation that it's creating. I can't support this for that reason, because I see what's involved and know what it is with bringing up children and seeing my children bringing up children, what's involved and what's invested in their lives and trying to get them going. And I think that this is not right, and I can't support this motion when something that will damage someone's health or lead them to harder drugs. What I'm asking for is that more education that education about the ill effects of drugs be made available in secondary schools especially. And the other thing, like Deputy Collins, I do support the use of medicinal cannabis for that purpose, where it is regulated.
Deputy
Thank you, Chair. I do acknowledge what Gino Kelly is doing here. In certain circumstances, I would agree with parts of it, but to support the bill, I can't as it stands. Medicinal cannabis can be used in certain situations, and I would like to see that done from the point of people that are suffering from chronic pain, cancer relief from treatments. But I would like to see this come through the doctors. I would like to see it through a doctor can prescribe something like this for a person, even if they're terminally ill, to give them a quality of life. But I'd like to see it coming through the medical profession, that at least there's a control mechanism there, that it means that the law would allow for it, but it has to be brought through your doctor or a consultant or something like that, for the quality of life of people that have chronic pain and suffering, for once the medical profession see that it's for that. But I would be 100% for that. But to make it legal, no, I wouldn't be. From that anyone can actually walk around with the drug. No, I'm a father. If one of my children, and even if they're adults, had an issue and they needed it for their own issue, even if they were terminal, I would ask to go to the medical profession and say, can you prescribe something that will help them? Yes, I will. And it has worked for Crohn's, it has worked for different things. So let the medical profession, let it be licensed through them. At least then we have some control over it, and at least the people that need it still get it, and it helps people. From that's where I would actually stand on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. We move on now to the independent group, Deputy Thomas Pringle and Deputy Joan Collins. 4 minutes each. Thank you.
Very good to hear. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on the Misuse of Drugs Cannabis Regulation Bill 2022, and to Gino and People Before Profit for bringing forward this legislation. I fully support this bill to criminalise the possession of small amounts of cannabis for personal use. Treating the possession of this as an offence is nonsensical and frankly ridiculous, and I believe that the majority of the public would agree as well. Not only this, but the criminalisation of people who are in possession of a small amount of cannabis is a massive waste of Garda time, especially during what we are told is a Garda shortage. Reports over the last few months indicate that the declining Garda numbers have caused Gardaí to struggle to keep up with policing demands, including 999 calls. One Garda member told the Irish Times recently that although Gardaí had complained for years about a shortage of Garda vehicles, they now don't have enough Gardaí to drive the vehicles. It doesn't make sense when the Gardaí are forced to waste their time on the possession of cannabis for personal use, while at the same time struggling to keep up with emergency calls. It is also a complete waste of time for the courts, which are also struggling to deal with a backlog of thousands of court summonses. 70% of all drug offences were for personal possession in 2022, contributing massively to the clog-up of our justice system and to the straining Garda resources. It is clear that our priorities are completely wrong here, and that our justice system is wasting its resources on people who are not causing any harm or danger. The Citizens' Assembly on Drugs has recommended the decriminalisation of certain drugs, including cannabis, as part of a move to look at drugs under a health-led approach as opposed to a criminal justice approach. I believe that the Citizens' Assembly wasted a major opportunity to draw on many important resources and international expertise, but still they came to this conclusion that cannabis should be decriminalised. So why then is the government dragging its heels on this? Why are we refusing to progress this bill today when all they're doing is stalling much needed reform? Research shows that drug-related deaths plummeted in Portugal following decriminalisation in 2001, remaining below 2001 levels and well below the current EU average. By not following up on the Citizens' Assembly recommendations, we are putting lives at risk, and we are failing to act on the Citizens' Assembly set out to do in the first place, to reform drugs policy in this country. Drug use is a reality of many people's lives across every community in Ireland. Pretending this isn't the case and continuing with the criminalisation of this is nonsensical and a serious step back. Reforming how we understand and respond to drug use should be a priority for us all. We cannot continue to stick our heads in the sand and pretend that we can continue to sustain the illegality of cannabis when it doesn't make sense. The reality is that this bill is very moderate. It really is a very small step forward, which is why it is so concerning that the government refuses to take this step. The Minister in her opening statement said that the government is committed to taking a health-led approach, while at the same time doing the opposite by stalling this very important bill and suggesting that the legislation is somehow premature. How can the decriminalisation of cannabis for personal use be premature when so many countries around the world and in Europe have not only decriminalised but have legalised the recreational use of cannabis? It is equally concerning that others in opposition have indicated that they would not vote in favour of decriminalisation of cannabis. Decriminalisation is an international best practice, and by voting against this legislation, you're going against international best practice and going against what actually makes sense, and makes sense in terms of freeing up scarce resources right across the country to work on where Gardaí resources can actually work on stuff that is of significance, rather than just clogging up the courts with loads of offenders for use of drugs for personal use. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.
First, I want to thank Gino, People for Profit, for introducing the Misuse of Drugs Cannabis Regulation Bill 2022. I welcome this bill. I will be supporting it. I also welcome the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs Use report released last week. The Citizens' Assembly report has given the government a mandate to move this country's national drug policy away from a focus of punishment and criminalisation and in line with international best practice towards a health and community-led approach and decriminalisation. What is clear from the 36 recommendations the Assembly has made is that there is an acceptance that the current approach isn't working. It doesn't work for reducing drug use, it doesn't work for the communities affected by drug use. The policies of prohibition and punishment compound the effects that addiction and drug misuse have on individuals and communities. The report accepts that drug misuse is not a single issue, it's not about a justice issue, it is a complex issue that works in conjunction with other health and socio-economic issues. I welcome the recommendations in the report that reflects this and calls for a wider socio-economic approach. Drug misuse and addiction must only be treated when it is approached in a way that recognises this complexity and intervenes in all aspects, including the health, social, economic and community factors. This is a simple bill. It's not calling for the legalisation of cannabis. It does not decriminalise cannabis. It simply removes the onus to prosecute someone for holding a small amount of cannabis for personal use. There's no need to criminalise someone over 7 grams of cannabis, no need for a prison sentence, or for someone's current or future employment or housing situation to be put at risk. The bill is exactly what the Citizens' Assembly is calling for, to move away from harsh treatment of minor drug possession and target the real problems that underlie drug misuse. We do not need the government's motion to kick this can down the road for 9 months. Anyone who has read the Citizens' Assembly report will tell you this bill clearly follows their recommendations. Prosecuting someone for holding up to 7 grams of cannabis does not target the gangs important and selling drugs. It doesn't end the poverty or deprivation which underlines much drug misuse. It does nothing for mental health supports. It doesn't help communities. It doesn't help families dealing with drug misuse. It doesn't even stop drug misuse. I would just like to add, in reaction to the Minister's reply earlier in the debate, increasing funding for drug treatment is great, but if you have any interest in ending drug misuse, what we need is to target the reasons why people end up misusing drugs or with problems with addiction in the first place. We have a CAM system falling apart, no real adult mental health system to talk of, a housing system that is causing mass immiseration. In 2022, we had a poverty rate of 13.1%, or over 650,000 people. These are the issues we need to be tackling. The government is failing on basic living standards in this country, from housing to wages to health and mental health. These are the issues that underline huge amounts of drug misuse and addiction, and that is what the Citizens' Assembly means when they talk about a wider socio-economic strategy. Real improvements to people's lives and the supports they have to access. This bill should be the first step in moving the decriminalisation of all drugs for personal use. just like the Citizens' Assembly has called for. That approach needs to be accompanied by a health and community-led national drug policy. We need a committee headed by the Taoiseach to oversee this move. And is the Government supporting that recommendation from the Citizens' Assembly?
Thank you, Deputy Bailey.
I want to start by commending this motion brought forward by Deputy Kenny and to say that it is extremely timely considering the Citizens' Assembly on Drug Use launched their report and recommendations last week. So firstly, it is positive that the Government established a Citizens' Assembly on Drug Use, and I welcome the fact that a select Oireachtas committee will now be set up to look at those recommendations, and I've expressed my interest in sitting on that committee. I look forward to the work they're commencing and hopefully being completed before the Dáil term comes to an end. That has to be the objective. I support the motion and I'm happy that the Government has not opposed it outright. Granted, it's been given a pregnancy stay. Criminalising the drug user has not worked, and I've said it many times and I'll say it again. It's not grounded in evidence, nor is it grounded in any respect for human dignity. It results in an over-reliance on punitive measures, something that we do not have capacity for. For example, today there are 4,768 people in custody, with 101 people sleeping on mattresses on the floor. That's shocking. This is at the same time we are draining the resources that could and should be invested in evidence-based services. So let's just absorb that fact. We have been and are continuing to incarcerate people for simple possession. I know when I met the then Governor of Mountjoy Prison, he stated that unfortunately there is a reality that those that end up incarcerated end up in the school of criminality. Does that make any sense at all? The fact stands, the current policy does not deter drug use effectively, so what has been done and what is being done is not working. Ultimately, Minister, when it comes to drug use, we as policymakers want those people to seek help. With criminalisation and how that only adds to the stigma towards the drug user, that is not really an option, not as it should be. Decriminalisation would encourage service development and uptake. It would go a long way to changing societal attitudes towards people with addictions, and that is the space that we need to be moving into. We need recognition from this Government that marginalised communities and those communities stuck in deprivation have had inequitable enforcement of drug laws and concentrated use of police powers, and so decriminalising can actually present an opportunity to address the mistrust between those communities and our An Garda Síochána. I'll finish on the last point. I didn't have time to go into the review of the MCAP, which was only recently completed, but I will say that because we have such a restricted version of medicinal cannabis access, which is hugely disappointing considering it's in place since 2019. Progress has been far too slow, and it leaves vulnerable people open to criminalisation and a life of stigma, intimidation from drug gangs and isolation, feeling like there is no help and that there is no hope. So I absolutely support this motion. Gormagat.
Thank you, Deputy. I call now on Minister Niall Collins.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to thank the members of the House for their contributions to this discussion on drugs policy and acknowledge their interest and commitment on this issue. The Government is fully committed to a health-led approach to drug use and believes that people with problematic drug and alcohol use should be treated with compassion and care. The Citizens' Assembly made 36 recommendations, which will next be considered by the Oireachtas. Recommendation number 17 calls on the State to introduce a comprehensive health-led response to the possession of drugs for personal use. This recommendation assumes that possession of controlled drugs would remain illegal, while those found in possession of drugs for personal use could be afforded extensive opportunities to engage with health-led services. Depending on how the legislation is designed, this approach would minimise or potentially completely remove the possibility for criminal conviction and prison sentences for simple possession. The Citizens' Assembly report advises that there are several open questions about how Ireland might best legislate for a health-led model combining diversion, decriminalisation and dissuasion. Given the important legal and constitutional issues to be considered, it is the responsibility of the Oireachtas, informed by legal advice and detailed pre-legislative scrutiny, to determine the most appropriate legal mechanisms to achieve this goal. To this end, as previously outlined, it is anticipated that a special Oireachtas committee will be established to consider in detail this and other recommendations and agree on the most appropriate next steps. In the interim, Government will continue to progress the health diversion programme, for people found in possession of drugs for personal use. The programme will divert people found to be in possession of drugs for personal use to health services rather than towards the criminal justice system. The implementation group has progressed plans for the commencement of the health diversion programme, including the operational aspects of the programme. A proposal to allow An Garda Síochána to refer people found in possession of drugs for personal use to the programme on an administrative basis has been developed, and legal advice is pending to determine how it can be put in place. We cannot be complacent about the impact of drug use on individuals, families and communities. The Citizens' Assembly has conducted the harmful impact of drugs on Irish society, from drug-related violence and intimidation to multiple health and social effects on people experiencing addiction and the upheaval and distress among family members. This is why the Citizens' Assembly was asked to carefully consider the legislative, policy and operation changes the state could make to significantly reduce the harmful impact of drugs. Discussing this bill without detailed consideration of the views of the Assembly would be disrespectful to the 100 citizens who could undermine the deliberations of the Oireachtas Committee. I therefore support the motion that the bill be deemed to be read a second time in 9 months.
The two final speakers is Breed Smith. Is that correct? Not here. All right. So, Gino Kenny, you have the floor. Thank you.
Probably a little bit more kind of progressive than the last debate we had in here about 11 years ago in relation to kind of similar issue. Some of the views I completely disagree with. The issue around which always really annoyed me is that cannabis is a gateway to harder drugs. Absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. The gateway to harder drugs, which we're talking about in this instance, heroin, is not cannabis. It's poverty, alienation and serious trauma. And alcohol, you know, has a lot to answer for in this country. It's a legal drug. I can walk out, literally out them 2 doors and into 2 bars that are that serve alcohol, and they will serve alcohol as much as I want. Alcohol kills 4 people a day in this country, 5% of all deaths. Now, if we go down the road of making alcohol illegal, if you think the drug wars were bad, wait till the alcohol wars come in. You'll wait and see what it will put the drugs wars into the halfpenny place. I mean, I find it incredible by Deputy Healy-Rae that he says that, you know, that cannabis is a gateway drug. He owns a pub, right? He owns a pub, right? Here, that's, you know, that is a substance. It's a psychoactive substance that, you know, most people do drink in this country. Most people don't have problematic use, but there are people that have problematic use with alcohol and they die. And there's, you know, a terrible issue around that. Minister, just in relation to some of the terminology you've used about undermining the Citizens' Assembly, being premature, being disrespectful. I don't know who writes this stuff, but we've been waiting for 6 decades for this debate. Now, things have moved on. I'm not sure, have yous moved on? Public opinion has, I think, moved much more kind of progressive in relation to this issue. They're not hung up about kind of the old tropes of stigmatization and the kind of, you know, the kind of just the rhetoric that can be used against people that use drugs. And most people that use drugs don't have problematic use in relation to their use. Some people do. We all acknowledge that. And people that have problematic use in relation to should get treatment as soon as possible. There is a huge kind of shortage of treatment beds in this country. And, you know, when people get treatment, you know, the outcomes are very, very, very good. In relation to the proliferation of drugs, since the 1970s, the availability of all sorts of drugs has increased. Now, you can't police your way out of a situation of the proliferation of drugs. It's just not possible. And other kind of jurisdictions across the world have said this is absolutely impossible. The amount of resources that go into trying to stop drugs, it's largely kind of a waste of resources. So other jurisdictions, particularly in South America, now have said, look, all the resources that go into to preventing drugs, not only in what happens in their countries, but obviously into Europe and the United States, it simply just doesn't work. So they're looking at different models in relation to decriminalisation and regulation, and that's very, very important. Just in relation to the Medical Cannabis Access Programme, and in 2019, the Misuse of Drugs Act was changed, was amended in relation to those that can get access to medical cannabis. Less than 100 people have got access. That's some via licence and some via the Medical Cannabis Access Programme. And kind of the irony at the end of some of it in this particular issue is that some people that have got a licence for medical cannabis actually have more than 7 grams on their person. In some cases, well, obviously there's the multiples of that if they're on a licence in relation to the medical cannabis. So they're lawfully allowed to have cannabis on them if they have a prescription, but if you don't have a prescription, you can be prosecuted. So there's huge kind of discrepancies in relation to that and in relation to the legislation that we're talking about. Finally, Minister, my life experience from growing up in Clondalkin, and I seen the terrible dark side to addiction, terrible dark side to addiction. What happens to the individual and what happens to communities and what happens to society as a whole in relation to, there is a dark side to drugs. There's no, we all acknowledge that. But my life experience says that continually criminalising people, continually putting people in prison, continually wasting vast resources in containment, into jailing people, bringing people through the criminal justice system, doesn't work. Doesn't work. So you have to look at different models in relation to how you go about of changing course. And one of the models is decriminalisation. And decriminalisation, just to be clear, is decriminalising the person rather than the drugs. Now, I think that's a good model, but it doesn't go, to me, it doesn't actually go far enough. There is kind of the shortcomings in relation to decriminalisation. Even in Portugal, it's not a perfect panacea by any means. Nothing is a perfect panacea, but something is better than letting people die, and that's what's happening in relation to drug-related deaths. So we have to change course. And to change course, we need to change our mindset and we need to change our laws. Because if we don't change the laws, Minister, it's lip service. And I've no doubt that there is elements in this government that are happy enough with the status quo. In fact, they probably want to even go more medieval than they've done before. I mean, the Green Party, I don't know where they are today, they support, they have quite a progressive policy around cannabis and kind of around drug policy. But they're going to be voting against this bill. I mean, they've sold their soul for the last 4 years, completely sold their soul. And there's some very, very good people in the Green Party in relation to a lot of issues that we've discussed over the lifetime of this government. So, Minister, it's disappointing, but considering the Citizens' Assembly's recommendations, it's unequivocal, just to say that again, it's unequivocal what the Citizens' Assembly chair has said. He said, there is no time to waste. We need to change course and change how people are dealt with in relation to drug use in Ireland. And that means legislative change. Because if you don't change the legislation, we're going to be in the same room in 10 years' time, probably talking about the same issues and same problems. So something's got to change. And where there's a will, there's a way. So that's the most important thing, Minister. And I think a lot of people that are listening and kind of, I suppose, viewing this debate, they may have different opinions maybe a number of years ago in relation to this. and they probably have changed. Now, some people have probably changed to the opposite side, saying, look, you know, lock people up and do all sorts. But I'm of the firm view that the majority in this people in this country have moved on, and they want to see things change in this country in relation to legislative change and in relation to harm reduction. So in that sense, Minister, as a public representative for the last 8.5 years in here, I think it's just disappointing to see, you know, the same rhetoric, the same lip service paid to this issue. So hopefully, and I think you're on the wrong side of history in relation to this, and in the lifetime of this government, you have a chance in relation to this Special Oireachtas Committee to make the changes, but the jury is out in relation to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. That concludes the debate, and I now have